Welcome back to our channel. In the early 19th century, the people who call themselves Aniyunwiya, commonly known as the Cherokee, undertook an extraordinary transformation. They made spoken law memory and public debate writable. Between the 1820s and 1838 in southeastern North America, Cherokee communities adopted Sequoyah's syllabary, established schools, codified statutes, and launched a bilingual newspaper that carried petitions, legal argument, and legislation into print. These innovations created instruments of collective voice and institutional capacity rarely seen among indigenous polities facing Anglo-American expansion. At the same time, the political environment around them hardened. State legislation in Georgia asserted jurisdiction over Cherokee lands. Federal policy turned toward removal, and a rush of settlers and miners intensified local pressure. Internal divisions deepened as a minority negotiated a treaty with the United States that many Cherokees rejected as illegitimate. Judicial rulings and printed memorials amplified Cherokee claims abroad, but they also made the nation legible to opponents who sought legal and political means to displace it. What led to this paradox? And why did instruments of literacy and law fail to protect homeland? This film traces the decade in which Cherokee mastery of print expanded civic reach, even as state power and congressional decisions translated documents into instruments of removal and dispossession. Principal Chief John Ross led a broad campaign of petitions to Congress and memorials to the President, while Cherokee councils relied on constitutions to assert political continuity. Worcester v. Georgia affirmed federal protection, but enforcement proved uncertain, exposing a gap between law and political will that the coming years would cruelly expose. Indeed, painfully. Between the 1790s and the 1830s, the Cherokee transformed many elements of public life in ways that made them legible to Anglo-American institutions. The 1827 Cherokee Constitution centralized governance. Sequoyah's syllabary turned oral practices into readable law and news. Schools multiplied, and a bilingual press published statutes, court reports, and moral debates. These changes strengthened internal administration and widened channels for petition and legal defense. They also produced documentary traces, land deeds, court records, printed petitions, and treaty drafts that outsiders could read and litigate against. Literacy and print therefore increased political capacity while simultaneously making the Cherokee Nation more visible within the legal and political vocabulary of the United States. Several deep forces set the stage. American expansionism after the Revolution and into the early 19th century placed increasing pressure on indigenous lands across the Southeast. States asserted broad interpretations of sovereignty and jurisdiction. Economic incentives intensified that pressure. Northern markets demanded cotton and southern planters sought new lands. Miners and prospectors rushed into upland Georgia after reports of gold and accessible land. The discovery of gold near Dahlonega in 1829 accelerated white migration into Cherokee Northeast Georgia and crystallized state claims that federal treaties and Cherokee institutions could not easily dislodge. Political shifts in Washington changed the legal environment. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 established a federal policy machinery for negotiating land cessions and promoting emigration to the trans-Mississippi West. The law authorized the president to exchange lands and allocate appropriations. It did not itself compel removal, but it framed removal as federal policy. At the same time, states such as Georgia passed statutes in the early 1830s that extended state courts and property law into Cherokee country, challenged tribal jurisdiction, and enabled local officials to warn leaseholders and litigants that state law would be enforced on lands that had been treated as Cherokee. Those statutes created overlapping claims of authority and legal confusion in which printed deeds and court orders mattered deeply. On the Cherokee side, leaders pursued a strategy rooted in law institutions and persuasion. Principal Chief John Ross and the National Council sought to defend sovereignty by using constitutions, treaties, court petitions, and appeals to the executive and to Congress. Cherokee attorneys and advocates argued that federal treaty obligations and Supreme Court jurisprudence protected their rights. The Cherokee Phoenix and other print outlets mobilized public opinion and collected signatures for memorials that reached Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington. These efforts reveal a deliberate policy of applying Anglo-American legal instruments to resist dispossession. Constraints truncated that strategy. The Cherokee Nation was politically factionalized. A treaty party led by figures including Major Ridge John Ridge and Elias Boudinot argued that negotiated removal with compensation was the least destructive option given mounting pressure. That faction's calculations reflected a mix of pragmatism, internal division, and pressure from settlers and agents. Where Ross sought to marshal legal remedies, the treaty party believed accommodation and migration might preserve lives and a degree of sovereignty in a Western homeland. The existence of competing leadership claims weakened a unified front and created a political opening for federal negotiators seeking a treaty with signatures they could present to the Senate. On the federal and state side, objectives and constraints also collided. Georgia sought to extend jurisdiction and open land markets. Federal officials balanced party politics, popular pressure, and the practicalities of enforcing court decisions. Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 affirmed a principle of federal protection for tribal sovereignty, yet the executive branch's willingness and capacity to enforce that doctrine against a resistant state and an assertive president was limited. The presidency navigated electoral politics' southern expansionist sentiment and the logistical challenges of relocating whole communities. In short, legal principle clashed with political calculation. Logistics and local enforcement shifted the balance from argument to action. County sheriffs marshaled pauses to eject claimants and to serve writs. Surveyors and land offices issued new titles. Contractors and military officers prepared routes and supply lists for potential emigrations. The expansion of market roads and river conveyances made rapid influx of settlers possible and increased the speed at which state law could be made effective on the ground. Seasonal rhythms also mattered. Petitions and lawsuits required time to travel. Harvesting and planting seasons shaped when men could appear in Washington. Storms and winter risks shaped the planning of any emigration. These temporal and material constraints meant that legal victories could be delayed or rendered moot if political enforcement moved faster than judicial remedies. Finally, cultural and economic entanglements complicated positions. Some Cherokee adopted plantation agriculture, and in some cases owned enslaved people, producing a legal and social entanglement with regional slaveholding interests that complicated solidarity with Anglo critics of removal. Missionary networks and Anglo allies offered support, but could not always pivot political opinion in state capitals. The net effect of these intersecting causes was that Cherokee literacy and institutions strengthened claims of nationhood, but could not by themselves alter the political incentives and local enforcement mechanisms that produced dispossession. The stage was thus set for a crisis in which print and petition would confront and then be overtaken by political will enforced by law officers and eventually by military power. The crisis moved forward in a sequence of incidents that made law and print collide with local power and ultimately with force. The first public shock came with the Cherokee Phoenix and the wider circulation of printed statutes and petitions. When the Phoenix began in 1828, it carried Council Acts land notices and debates in both Cherokee and English. What had been spoken law now moved quickly across towns and plantations. Publication enabled coordinated petitions and brought Cherokee claims into the sightlines of state legislatures and national newspapers. That visibility intensified opposition in Georgia, where local magistrates and hostile newspapers treated printed assertion of sovereign law as a provocation and as ammunition for asserting state jurisdiction over Cherokee country. The paper's masthead and bilingual columns thus helped unify internal resistance, while also supplying opponents with readable material they could cite in courts and legislative campaigns. A second incident narrowed legal principle into acute contest. In 1831, Georgia officials arrested several non-Cherokee missionaries and printed supporters for residing in Cherokee country without state permits. Those arrests produced the court case that reached the Supreme Court as Worcester v. Georgia. The court's 1832 decision affirmed that the Cherokee Nation possessed an independent political community with exclusive authority over its territory. Yet, the ruling encountered practical resistance from state authorities, who declined full compliance. The delay between judicial pronouncement and on-the-ground effect revealed a structural vulnerability. A favorable legal finding could be nullified by a state's refusal to accept federal enforcement and by the slowness of congressional or executive action to translate law into protection. The third incident that escalated the crisis was a diplomatic rupture within the Cherokee polity itself. In late 1835, a minority delegation of Cherokee leaders negotiated and signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding large tracts in the southeast in exchange for land west of the Mississippi and financial compensation. The treaty was presented to the Senate without the sanction of the Cherokee National Council, and when ratified in 1836, it carried the force of law in Washington, even as Principal Chief John Ross and the majority continued to protest. From New Echota to Washington, the paperwork of treaty-making moved faster on through federal channels than the Cherokee petitions and memorials could check it. The circulation of memorials and signatures amounted to a parallel documentary campaign, but the Senate's vote translated a minority pact into national policy. Those three incidents, publication and visibility, petition and arrest, and court affirmation, treaty and ratification, were mediated by the material tempos of the era. Petitions and printed memorials traveled by courier steamboat and postal packet. Legal writs were delivered by county officers. Surveyors and land offices issued new titles on a seasonal calendar of planting and harvesting. The time it took for a petition to reach Washington and a decision to return could be measured in months. Meanwhile, surveyors and settlers could occupy a farm, and a county sheriff could execute a writ within days. That temporal gap turned law into a race against occupation. The immediate effects were local and uneven. In some counties, seizures of fields and title disputes displaced families. In others, local sheriffs detained Cherokee men for resisting state statutes. Disease and social dislocation followed legal seizures as households lost access to fields just before winter. The printed record preserved lists of names and memorials, even as the living network of clan and kinship was fractured. Those documents would later serve as evidence and as the basis for petitions, but at the moment, they were insufficient to halt arrest seizures. And the growing consensus in some quarters that removal was the administrable solution. John Ross Memorial, Washington, D.C., 1836, 06-21. By the stipulations of this instrument, we are despoiled of our private possessions, the indefeasible property of individuals. We are denationalized. We are disfranchised. We are deprived of membership in the human family. Return to the record that protest crystallized the paradox. Print made the Cherokees' case clearer and more official than ever before, and yet paper evidence did not by itself compel the political or military force necessary to secure the rights the documents asserted. The sequence of legal contests and printed petitions gave way to organized enforcement in the spring of 1838, when federal policy shifted from dispute resolution to the practical machinery of removal. The President and the War Department moved to implement the Treaty of New Echota, and Major General Winfield Scott was charged with coordinating the operation. His orders established a framework of collection points, military supervision, and contracted transport that turned what had been a contested legal question into a nationwide administrative task. That change of emphasis, law as paper and orders as movement, marked the decisive transition from argument to action. Collection depots and stockade camps were established at nodes along rivers and roads where county officials, federal agents, and army detachments could concentrate families for onward passage. Fort Cass Ross Landing and Gunter's Landing became institutional centers in which Cherokee households were registered, cataloged, and held, while contractors and military officers arranged conveyance. The stated purpose was temporary containment pending organized emigration. In practice, the camps became sites of congestion and exposure, as families waited for transport and for favorable seasonal windows. registers commissary lists and surgeon returns, record shortages of shelter, late or inadequate rations, and frequent outbreaks of disease. The paperwork shows intention, the field reports show failure to protect the vulnerable under strain. Logistics for the operation combined military oversight with commercial contracting. The Office of Indian Affairs and the War Department engaged civilian wagon masters, riverboat captains, and teamsters who were paid by distance and head count. That payment structure created perverse incentives. Faster convoys and lower per-head costs favored speed and economy over comprehensive care. Oversight was uneven. Correspondence between agents and superintendents documents broken wagons, shorted provisions, delayed payments, and contractors who abandoned routes. When the transport system failed, detachments waited in exposed camps or set out under-provisioned, increasing exposure to illness and to the hazards of weather and rough terrain. On the ground, the enforcement sequence combined legal authority with coercive practice. County sheriffs and local posses executed writs, served eviction orders, and in many cases, physically removed people from their homes. Eyewitness accounts describe sudden roundups, cabins entered in the midst of daily life, and households marched at gunpoint into stockades. These actions converted legislative assertions into immediate dispossession, often in seasons that left families without time to harvest or secure winter stores. The timing of seizures relative to agricultural cycles intensified hardship, producing immediate shortfalls in food and shelter that the removal apparatus was ill-equipped to remedy. The marches themselves unfolded along a variety of corridors. Some detachments moved by river, where steamboats and flatboats could carry people and goods. Others traveled by wagon on roads that were little more than rutted tracks. Routes crossed floodplains, ridgelines, and swollen streams. Seasonal storms turned roads to mud and slowed convoys. Medical officers attached to removals reported recurring illnesses, diarrhea, dysentery, measles, and respiratory fevers, and noted that infants, the elderly, and the chronically ill comprised a disproportionate share of casualties. Where rations were late or insufficient, and where wet, cold weather combined with crowded quarters, mortality rose. Administrative records indicate that many deaths occurred in internment camps before marches even began, and that death continued sporadically along routes where supply lines failed or detachments were delayed. Administrative design and moral intention diverged in practice. Orders and contracts provided a documentary spine for the operation. Contractor ledgers and military returns supplied the surface account of miles moved and wagons employed. Those documents also reveal operational admissions, shortages of tents, mismatched provisions, and inadequate medical supplies. The human consequences appear in missionary letters and in retrospective recollections that emphasize names, kinship ruptures, and particular losses. Where official forms recorded headcounts, the oral memory preserved routes and the names of the missing. Both sets of evidence are necessary to reconstruct what the operation produced: a technically organized movement that nonetheless failed repeatedly to safeguard life under the conditions it created. The proximate causes of death and suffering were therefore logistical and administrative as much as they were the result of malice. Contractors' payment terms limited patience for delays. Military priorities emphasized compliance and speed. Local hostility and insufficient oversight compounded risks. Yet these material failings were embedded in a larger political calculus. The federal and state authorities prioritized the enforcement of a ratified treaty and the opening of land markets over the robust protection of the population to be moved. In operational terms, the campaign converted law into an executory procedure that required capacity the available institutions could not reliably deliver. Cherokee oral histories and community memory emphasize betrayal and the personal devastation of roundups and marches. Administrative records emphasize contracts, orders, and returns. The two perspectives together show how a formally decreed removal became in practice an enforced migration with high human cost. A process in which the instruments of governance and law created the framework for displacement, even as they proved unable to secure the basic protections that justify legal authority. The operational design described before produced its decisive consequence in late spring and early summer of 1838, when collection and conveyance moved from plan to execution, and the human costs became immediate. Troops and agents enforced registration and concentration at depots such as Fort Cass, Ross Landing, and Gunter's Landing. Families were cataloged, issued removal papers, and held pending conveyance. What had been a sequence of petitions and court rulings was now a timetable and a series of manifests. Administrative rhythm replaced civic debate, and the tempo of enforcement determined who lived and who died. Crowding and delay in the depots amplified vulnerability. Men, women, and children held in stockades and barracks faced exposure and contagion while waiting for transports or for contractors to assemble wagons. Surgeon returns and missionary letters repeatedly note that many deaths occurred before marches began, illness spreading in cramped quarters where blankets and proper shelter were scarce. The operational record recorded shortages and breakdowns, late or insufficient rations, broken wagons, and erratic contractor performance. An officer's report conceded the basic practical failure. Winfield Scott, letter, Fort Cass, 1838, 0608. Many Cherokees had not been allowed to take bedding, cooking utensils, clothes, and ponies. That admission against interest underlines how seizure practices and local enforcement choices stripped households of means that would have reduced exposure and suffering. When detachments finally moved, their routes compounded risk. Some detachments traveled by river, others by wagon over roads that became quagmires in wet weather or ice in late winter and early spring. Convoys delayed by bad roads or broken equipment stayed longer in exposed camps. Detachments hurried to meet contractor schedules, sometimes pushed on, despite illness in the ranks. The demographic profile, large numbers of infants, elderly, and chronically ill, meant that any delay or deficiency in shelter, nutrition, or medical care translated quickly into fatalities. Reports from medical officers list dysentery, measles, and pneumonia among the chief causes. Contemporaneous tallies and later reconstructions show mortality concentrated in the very categories least able to survive enforced movement. Administrative incentives and fragmentation worsened outcomes. Contractors paid by distance and headcount economized on care. Military priorities emphasized compliance and pace. County officials sought rapid clearance of land for market use. At the same time, Cherokee capacity to organize emigration under its own leadership was curtailed by arrest and by the seizure of supplies. Efforts by Principal Chief John Ross to negotiate staged departures and to place Cherokee conductors in charge of particular detachments mitigated some harms where permitted. Where command arrangements left care to civilian contractors, mortality rose. The contrast between detachments that traveled under Cherokee supervision and those under thinly policed contractors provides an evidentiary basis for a narrow, counterfactual pacing and provisioning reduced death rates where they were implemented. The turning point, therefore, reveals both an operational and a political truth. The ratified treaty and the machinery built to enforce it translated document into movement. Once enforcement became the objective, the ethical and logistical obligations implicit in law required administrative capacity and oversight that the combined federal, state, and contractor apparatus too often failed to supply. The result was a routinized removal that complied with the letter of orders, while failing the moral purpose of protection. Names, lists, and petitions survived on paper, even as kinship networks were fractured in the field. That failure set the conditions for long-term demographic and political consequences communities broken by loss and displacement. Leadership contests intensified by exile. And a reconstructed Cherokee political life that had to deploy the very instruments of print and law that had earlier proved insufficient to prevent dispossession. The operational design described before produced its decisive consequence in late spring and early summer of 1838, when collection and conveyance moved from plan to execution, and the human costs became immediate. Troops and agents enforced registration and concentration at depots such as Fort Cass, Ross Landing, and Gunter's Landing. Families were cataloged, issued removal papers, and held pending conveyance. What had been a sequence of petitions and court rulings was now a timetable and a series of manifests. Administrative rhythm replaced civic debate, and the tempo of enforcement determined who lived and who died. Crowding and delay in the depots amplified vulnerability. Men, women, and children held in stockades and barracks faced exposure and contagion while waiting for transports or for contractors to assemble wagons. Surgeon returns and missionary letters repeatedly note that many deaths occurred before marches began, illness spreading in cramped quarters where blankets and proper shelter were scarce. The operational record recorded shortages and breakdowns, late or insufficient rations, broken wagons, and erratic contractor performance. An officer's report conceded the basic practical failure. Winfield Scott letter, Fort Cass, 1838, 06-08. Many Cherokees had not been allowed to take bedding, cooking utensils, clothes, and ponies. That admission against interest underlines how seizure practices and local enforcement choices stripped households of means that would have reduced exposure and suffering. When detachments finally moved, their routes compounded risk. Some detachments traveled by river, others by wagon over roads that became quagmires in wet weather or ice in late winter and early spring. Convoys delayed by bad roads or broken equipment stayed longer in exposed camps. Detachments hurried to meet contractor schedules, sometimes pushed on, despite illness in the ranks. The demographic profile, large numbers of infants, elderly and chronically ill, meant that any delay or deficiency in shelter, nutrition, or medical care translated quickly into fatalities. Reports from medical officers list dysentery, measles, and pneumonia among the chief causes. Contemporaneous tallies and later reconstructions show mortality concentrated in the very categories least able to survive enforced movement. Administrative incentives and fragmentation worsened outcomes. Contractors paid by distance and headcount economized on care. Military priorities emphasized compliance and pace. County officials sought rapid clearance of land for market use. At the same time, Cherokee capacity to organize emigration under its own leadership was curtailed by arrest and by the seizure of supplies. Efforts by Principal Chief John Ross to negotiate stage departures and to place Cherokee conductors in charge of particular detachments mitigated some harms where permitted. Where command arrangements left care to civilian contractors, mortality rose. The contrast between detachments that traveled under Cherokee supervision and those under thinly policed contractors provides an evidentiary basis for a narrow counterfactual pacing and provisioning reduced death rates where they were implemented. The turning point, therefore, reveals both an operational and a political truth. The ratified treaty and the machinery built to enforce it translated document into movement. Once enforcement became the objective, the ethical and logistical obligations implicit in law required administrative capacity and oversight that the combined federal, state, and contractor apparatus too often failed to supply. The result was a routinized removal that complied with the letter of orders while failing the moral purpose of protection. Names, lists, and petitions survived on paper even as kinship networks were fractured in the field. That failure set the conditions for long-term demographic and political consequences, communities broken by loss and displacement. Leadership contests intensified by exile, and a reconstructed Cherokee political life that had to deploy the very instruments of print and law that had earlier proved insufficient to prevent dispossession. The immediate aftermath of enforced removal reconfigured Cherokee political life, even as it preserved key institutions born in print. Arrivals in Indian Territory began in 1838 and continued into 1839. The nation's leaders and councils reassembled, drafted new governing instruments, and published laws and proclamations in Cherokee and English to reestablish civil order. The 1839 Constitution and subsequent council records show an explicit effort to transplant governmental forms courts, annuity accounting, and school charters that had earlier appeared in the Southeast and to adapt them to the exigencies of exile. These printed statutes and minutes became the administrative backbone for a reconstituted polity while also providing documentary traces for later claims and reparative petitions. Documents central to this phase include the Treaty of New Echota text emigration rolls and removal manifests, General Order No. 25 surgeon and commissary returns from internment depots. Cherokee Phoenix issues reprinted in the territory, and the 1839 Cherokee Constitutional Acts. Administration of post-removal affairs combined federal promises with messy execution. Federal annuity ledgers and congressional appropriation records documented compensations and payments negotiated under the treaty, but disbursement was slow and frequently contested. Claims and allotment disputes filled Indian office files for years. Court dockets and agent correspondence record petitions for arrears and for title clarifications. At the same time, the federal government established reservation boundaries and negotiated leases and access rights that reshaped land use in the new territory. These legal and fiscal papers became a second layer of documentation evidence of resettlement terms of failures in timely relief and of ongoing administrative entanglement between Cherokee institutions and federal agencies. Demography and health shifted sharply in the removal's wake. Emigration rolls and surgeon returns indicate that mortality was concentrated among the most vulnerable infants, the elderly, and the chronically ill. Census snapshots in the decade after resettlement show population rebounds in some districts, but also persistent gaps where entire kin groups failed to reconstitute. Epidemics continued to afflict frontier settlements. Missionary journals and physician registers document outbreaks of measles, smallpox, and consumption that shaped family structures and labor capacity. These medical and population records form an archival trail that quantifies loss, even as oral memory names the missing and preserves their stories. Cultural continuance proved resilient and inventive. The Cherokee syllabary remained a central instrument. School books and church tracts in Cherokee script circulated in the territory, and printing presses issued legal codes and newspapers that sustained literacy. Ceremonial life and seasonal rounds adapted to new geography. Winter counts, ledger art, and oral histories recorded the removal itself as a foundational moment in community memory. Fact versus folklore. Archival ledgers and surgeon returns supply statistical contours of mortality and movement, while ceremonial accounts and winter counts preserve the names of lost camps, roots, and ancestors in a register of communal grief and survival. Both registers are necessary to recover the full human scale of aftermath. Political life also remained contested. The assassinations and reprisals against treaty party signers illustrated how internal divisions hardened into cycles of violence and exile. Council minutes and contemporary petitions record prosecutions and public retribution that followed the removal years. Yet, governance continued, courts convened, laws were posted, land distribution schemes were debated, and schools were reopened, often with the same Cherokee agents who had previously administered in the Southeast. These continuities show how institutional memory and print culture enabled the nation to reimpose order while negotiating legitimacy and reconciliation. Memory and commemoration carried the removal into subsequent political life. Petitions and memorials to Congress in the decades after 1838 invoked the treaty text lists of names from removal rolls and surgeon returns as proof in petitions for compensation or legal redress. Community rituals, annual remembrances, ledger paintings, and recited winter counts kept the removal alive as civic pedagogy. In the present day, the people who call themselves Aniyunwiya continue political and cultural programs, language revitalization, archival preservation of Phoenix issues and removal rolls, and legal advocacy rooted in historic treaty commitments, demonstrating that loss of homeland did not terminate nationhood, but transformed its modalities of survival. Taken together, the records of administration annuities, medical returns, constitutional acts, and community memory form a complex postscript, a people reduced in place and population who nevertheless used the written instruments they had developed. Law presses, petitions, and registers to rebuild political institutions, preserve cultural practice, and sustain claims that would endure in archives, courts, and ceremonies for generations. Scholarly assessment of the removal era centers on three interrelated conclusions. First, the Cherokee adoption of a written syllabary, a constitution, and a bilingual press materially strengthened internal governance and expanded the nation's capacity to present legal arguments and petitions in forms legible to Congress and to courts. Those institutional gains were real and consequential for post-removal governance. Second, legal recognition alone proved insufficient when political majorities and enforcement choices in state and federal institutions favored dispossession. Judicial rulings and printed memorials could register rights, but could not compel protection when executive and local authorities resolved to act otherwise. Third, despite exile and demographic loss, the Cherokee reconstituted political institutions in Indian Territory and sustained language, cultural practice, and civic memory. Print instruments remained central to that recovery and to later claims for justice. Contested issues persist in the literature and in archival interpretation. Estimates of mortality during internment and on the march vary by methodology and source. Aggregate figures depend on the inclusion criteria for pre-departure camp deaths and on the reliability of contractor and agent returns. So confidence in precise totals remains medium. The motivations and intentions of treaty party signers continue to generate debate. Some historians emphasize pragmatic calculations made under duress, while others stress factional ambition and short-term gain. Assessments of culpability and motive therefore range across a spectrum and warrant careful contextualization. Responsibility for failure of protection is also contested in nuance. Georgia state actions and statutes materially enabled dispossession, federal ratification, provided legal cover, and administrative failures in contracting and oversight produced the conditions of death. Assigning relative weight among those factors is an interpretive judgment that recent scholarship addresses with differing emphasis. The enduring legacy of these events is both institutional and moral. Institutionally, the episode shaped American law and policy debates about tribal sovereignty, federalism, and treaty obligations. Worcester v. Georgia, the Treaty of New Echota, and General Order. No 25 remain touchstones in legal histories of indigenous rights. Morally and culturally, the removal entered Cherokee communal pedagogy as a defining rupture, preserved in Wintercount's ledger art oral testimony and civic ritual. Language survival and contemporary revitalization efforts make the syllabary itself an ongoing instrument of political and cultural continuity. For historians and publics, the Cherokee experience registers a durable lesson about the limits of legal argument when confronted by political force, and about the resourcefulness of a people who used print to rebuild governance and preserve memory. This episode endures in public memory and scholarship because it demonstrates with archival clarity that rights require both recognition on paper and the political and administrative structures necessary to secure them in practice. If this episode changed how you see law and power, help us keep the conversation going. Subscribe and tell us, should modern treaty obligations be enforced differently today? Drop a short comment with your answer.